So I'll record. So this is being recorded. So I don't expect you to code as I code, but you can do if you can do it speedily, because I will try to intersperse it with explanation and discussion. Feel free to ask me questions through your microphones or through the chat. But what I'd like to do is try to give you an idea of the kind of shape that, you know, why it's important for several different reasons, not just because it's kind of a concept that leads into the coursework, and I'll talk about the coursework in a moment, but also as a general set of concepts, how it feeds into stuff you do in the second year, how it feeds into data structures, algorithms, and so on. Let's begin, and as people arrive, they can just catch on to where we are. So very, very briefly, next week is all about objects and data in objects. If you want to ask, please ask a question. Don't worry about just interrupting me, folks. Someone's got their microphone on, I think. So it's all about objects and about data in objects. Now, you know, if you look at the lecture material for 5, I know that at least 1 or 2 of you have already gone through it all and helped me spot a typo, thankfully, in one of the worksheets. It was a bit too complicated. I can still hear you, whoever that is. You have your microphone. You have your microphone on. Okay. Data in objects. So let's try to make this practical. What I'm going to do is build a very, very simple application, but I'm going to do it in a way that will help emphasize some critical concepts, okay? Remember, the word package it's this environment's way of saying folder. It mirrors folder structures on your hard disk. Okay, so have a look over here. Under the source folder, instead of my files, I've called it infrastructure because I want to emphasize a concept I've not mentioned so far. You may have heard it if you're doing web stuff. You may have come across it in your previous study. Infrastructure is all about front end and back end. Okay, so for example, I've just had a job request from a colleague who's got a recruiting agent for graduating students, and it's all about this distinction, front end development versus back end development. You know, the various different ways we chop that up and how that works in the industry. So what I've done, because this is going to be critical, it will be written into the coursework. The next thing I'm going to say to you. So the backend server is going to contain the object that's going to look after my piece of data, which is going to be an array of integers. Now, if at this stage you hear me say array of integers and you think, I have no idea what that is, or it's sometimes just a full set your put. Okay. If you wonder what an array of integers are, the week 5 links back to week 3. So they're deliberately closely allied. So it gives you a chance to go back to that and come forward a little bit more. But back-end code never has, now this is going to be a rule I'm going to say is an absolute. It's going to be written into the coursework, because if you put system out print lines and console write and read and write stuff into your back-end code, you will lose marks, okay? So you have to, in your mind, start separating out stuff to do with a client and stuff to do with, aren't we on week 4? I'm confused. Robert, we have just completed week 4. I talked about week 4 last lecture. This lecture I'm anticipating next week, which is week 5. Does that help? Okay, right. Just in case anyone else wondered what I was waffling on about. Yeah, so I'm anticipating the material you've got next week, which is the pivotal week, right? So the distinction between back-end stuff, which has no idea of how it's deployed and should be written without that sense of how it's deployed. And there's a reason that object-oriented programming has been so powerful because of that reason. That's one of the reasons. Then you have front-end code, and front-end code can obviously be built using graphical user interfaces, mobile apps, web pages. So your console utility is only for the front end. It's to help simplify the code in your front end. It does not go into the back end. The back end code never interacts with your console utility. So I've just kind of put together one quickly. which has, print statements. I've called them underscore out. I don't know why I had such an obscure name, but these are basically variations. You'll notice I've got a third variation here. Yeah, so Tom, let me try to give you an idea. Well, this is what I'm hoping to demonstrate, okay? So Tom, if you can hold that. Tom's question was, can you give us an example of what front-end versus back-end code would look like? Exactly what I hope to do in a second, okay? And this example actually parallels some of the developments in web as well. So hopefully you'll see that distinction. Here in my front end, it's all to do with output and input from the console, right? This is a nice output statement. If you look at it, it passes a whole array in and it displays an array. Now, hold that question a second, so I'll come back to that. Look at this for loop. This for loop is a different type of for loop, and it actually is even simpler than a for I, one with a counter. And you'll notice I'll be using this a lot more, and I'll explain what's going on. Okay. Why is nothing in the front end static? I've actually stripped out all the static stuff. The static stuff was, you can keep it in your console interface, your utils, whatever you call it, you can keep it there because it will happily interact with your static main, right? That will be fine. The reason I kicked it out, it is a bit like that, Hector, absolutely. That's like the Python concept, very similar. The reason I've got rid of all the statics in my console utility is because actually I find I like objects. Objects make sense. And even if you use an object as a component, which does this kind of job like this utility, I find it neater and easier to work with. It's also better for other purposes. And it's me, you'll notice in the lectures next week, for example, in the notes, I literally get fed up with static because you have to keep on importing this, importing that with the keyword static here. It's like strip out the word static out of all of your console and then you just use it as an object. And that's what I'm going to demonstrate as well. So is it lazy? Why did I bother teaching you the static stuff? Because I think actually the static stuff leads you in the right direction to understand how objects work. So there's my basic, that's kind of useless explanation. I'm not sure, Sol, if that helped. Okay, so there's my initial console utility, right? I've kind of used this really obscure way of writing them, and you'll probably find that really clumsy. Look at how more you can do with it. If I want to output the content of an array, for those who have studied the array stuff, I can do it like that. So I can pass a whole array in and it will pop it onto the screen for me, for example. Okay, so if you're testing that you've populated it properly, it's good, simple mechanism. I'll leave that in there just to show you. That's obviously hopefully nice and familiar to you. Notice that the rule here, by having a scanner object inside a getInt, it does something, it's what's called black box programming. Black box programming means that whenever you call a particular method, function, you have minimal amount of exchange of data. If it can create its objects within it and do the job, the object will be cleared up when that method is no longer being used. That black box thinking is one of the reasons we have such massive systems. You don't have to worry then about passing pieces of information around and they can get lost in here, there, and everywhere. Now that's an approach to programming. It's not an absolute in terms of everyone codes like that, because that would be crazy to say. Object-oriented programming is very flexible. And can I say something to contradict myself straight away? There is a textbook which I would burn if I could, which actually has system out print line statements when it's introducing objects in the back end. And I just think that's book burning. Yeah. The problem is with that is that it might be like the static concept, which wasn't perfectly effective in terms of giving you a transition. These types of concepts muddle up stuff, right? So anyway, we all know that nothing's perfect here. So I've got infrastructure, which is my basic folder. This is just to illustrate a concept, this folder structure here. Front-end client is going to contain my application, which has my main, and my console utilities. I'm also giving you a little bit of a hint of how you might want to sort out your coursework as well. So I'm going to create an object which is going to look after an array of integers. And what I'm going to talk through is how we would do that, what the code would look like, how you would populate it and stuff like that. Now, I might not get all the way through because I'm hoping you'll interrupt me and ask me questions. But in that process, it will give you a summary of what next week is all about. And I'll try to link it to the coursework. And the other thing to be said about the coursework, because I'm rewriting it as we speak, in fact, I'm rebuilding the actual coursework text, so I can scale it so the complexity is all carefully managed and all that kind of jazz. It's made me very conscious that in the breakout room, in the breakout stuff, what I'm going to start giving you to do is group breakout exercises, not just to practice the concept, but I'm going to give you stuff which I don't cover anywhere else. And that's up to you as a group to work through it, come to the sessions, chat to each other, but do it. Because, for example, it's a perfect opportunity for you to knock your heads together and work out how to code certain things, which will be useful for you in your coursework. So your breakout room activity group exercises will start linking more and more to the coursework, and they will almost be an independent element as well. So I'll encourage you, even if in your groups you don't do them, you still attempt them, just to make sure that you're covering everything that, you know, sets you up. Remember, after the week after next, you have 3 weeks off. Yes, so the timing of it works like this. As David has just asked, when do we start the coursework? In order for you to start the coursework, you need to be confident with this concept that you're learning in week 5. Week 6 is another practice of the same concept. Immediately after Easter, you will have your coursework lectures, let's call that. So everything you will learn will be directly related, and the level up, the concepts will increase. We will introduce a couple of new concepts, but they are directly used in the coursework. Even the example I'm going to use, I think in week 7, which is the week we come back, is one you can start adapting straight away, working into your coursework. So the aim is that you'll have about 3 or 4 weeks to work on your coursework. The lectures themselves will support each sort of item and concept as you build your way through it. The idea is to make you learn it, right? After Easter, not before Easter. Okay, so the idea is for you to learn this stuff and to sort of benefit from it, because you're going to go into your second years. Comp science students are going to do more Java. And if you don't learn anything, you're going to struggle in the second year, right? Yeah, straight after, yeah. But what you'll notice, release part 3 earlier without the coursework. I'm not sure. Could you possibly release a few extra object tasks over eaters? Yeah, Hector, I could do it. I think I preferred eaters. Yes, actually, Hector, that's a good point. So my aim is in consolidation week, when you all go away for consolidation week, I will build a bunch of tasks. So this is linked to what Hector has just asked. My aim is not to burden you with tons of stuff over Easter, because I'm not sure what your other deadlines are like, but to give you small exercises, each of which will help you move towards the doing of the coursework, okay? Consolidating and building up, because as I'm writing a solution, as I'm rewriting the code, I'm looking at the complexity and the concepts that I need to make sure that you've had time to practice independently. So the breakout room exercise next week, I'll tell you at the end of this lecture, and I'd recommend that you do that, because that will be incredibly useful, and you'll see it once you see the shape of the coursework. I'm hoping it all fits together. Yes, so Hector, absolutely, I will filter in stuff for you. That's a good question. The support team should be there, Billy. I think Shah and Eleni are around. It all depends. I think all of us may be just taking a week off just to have a break. Maybe a good idea for you to do the same thing, just to get a little bit of a breather. But yes, as far as I know, we are not offline. We are still officially working, unless we formally take a holiday. So we are, yeah, thanks. So unless we formally take holiday and accept Easter, Good Friday and Easter Monday, aside from those formal, UK holidays, we will be expected to be at work. So, feel free to contact them and arrange stuff with them. It could be really useful to you. Okay, so the general strategy is, if I haven't muddied the water, and I'm careful to try not to, and sometimes I overtalk, inevitably. But okay, so up to Easter, next week's concept is the new concept. We're going to run through it here, okay, in a second. I need to speed up a bit. It's basically one sheet with lots of videos. Okay, Max, that's too kind. I can tell you lots of people. My sister used to say to me, when I spoke to her, especially about philosophy, she would go into what she called a voluntary coma, which I think summed up really, really well the fact that I can talk too much. Right, okay. Yeah, so I'll get on with that. I'll stop the waffling. So up to Easter, you get only one new concept and you need to be really confident with it. That's the thing I'm introducing now. And next week you get the chance for it. If you cannot get your worksheet done next week, remember, you can sign it off the week after as well, but try not to do that. Otherwise it would just go, that would just go. I did have a podcast for the book that I wrote, but that's just crazy. We're getting distracted. Right. The one thing to note is that the week 6 worksheet will be the last worksheet you do. You won't have any more worksheets to do after Easter, because then everything I will do with you, including all the exercises, listening to the comments from Hector and the rest of you about how to filter in elements of the coursework, that will be my aim. My aim will be, as I teach you something, I'll get you to build something. So whether you see the coursework in one big block or you see it in short little steps to help you negotiate your way into it, I've yet to decide. It all depends how quickly the moderation works with it. But that's my priority at the moment, to get it all drafted and written and updated in the next week. Okay, so let's have a look. So this is my console utils. Over here, I have my application. What I'm missing is my actual server code. So I'm going to create a Java class in my backend server, and I'm going to call it, it's going to manage an integer array. In the example I give you in the notes next week, I give it a name which almost looks like integer array, might confuse some of you. So I'm going to call this NB array. Now, why am I calling it NB array? I don't know if you know the story of Steve Jobs, but when he left Apple, he set up a company. What was the name of the company? It had the initials NS. But he created a whole bunch of objects to work with iPhones. Yes, Next Step, I think it is. Yeah. So he used the prefix NS, and it was a way of identifying their custom objects they'd built to support Microsoft's Word. He built all these objects. So it was just a simple strategy. NB, my initials, my array. Okay, so it's my array. It's now sitting in my backend. Now, this is something, non-binary array. I like that. That's funny. Now, here's a nice thing, and I'm not sure if our Visual Studio Code people will get the benefit of this. In my backend array, NB array, which is going to be used as an object, right? I am going to create, and I use the word private for the first time. I think I was the first time I'm using it. And what the word private means is that this is not part of the interface of this object. You cannot get direct access to it. Okay, so I'm going to create an integer array, and let's just call it IA for short. That is all you need to do to create what's called a member variable, a piece of data sitting inside. Yeah, I mean, if you have problems, Aaron, come tomorrow to the 4 o'clock session. Do that, and we can chat then. Right, have a look at that line. That one line, right? Private, okay, no, it's a good question, Ozzy. Private means it's not part of the object interface to be used. Look, I'll show you. I'll demonstrate this to you, okay? I'm going to write a method here called, now let's demonstrate this in stages. Okay, that's a bare object. Okay, if I come over to my client, now I can't remember who said it. Someone up there asked me the question, the front end, back end, what does it look like? Okay, so this is me answering it. That's a bit of back end code. At the moment, it just has a piece of data, nothing else. So I'm going to do this in parallel. I'll go back to my front end, and I'm going to create the object from my back end, right? And this is how I do it. So my name of my class is NB array, okay? I have to give my object a name. If I just call it NB, I'll do. I'll call it that, right? Not a brilliant name. Then I create an object. So I use the new word, then I repeat the name of the object, and the bracket is empty. And I'll explain the bracket in a moment and what we do with that bracket, because we're going to change this, right? That's the line of code that creates the object. So if I run this, hopefully it won't crash. And you notice, did you notice it did this? It did it, right? So it's run, it hasn't crashed, it's created that object. At the moment, I can't see anything inside my object. If I want to see what's inside my object, now this is the bit that's a little bit confusing, because Java and IntelliJ, if you hit dot, what's inside my object? That's all this stuff. But for the time being, the only one that you're going to look at later is the toString, and I'll talk about that later. Everything else just temporarily ignore, okay? I haven't built any of it, okay? So the point is that that data is invisible. But look what happens if I go back here to NB array and I turn that, this is Ozzy, your question, I think. If I make that public, right? Remember the name of it, it's IA, come back to my application and type in my object, NB array, and hit dot, there it is. Yes, Sol, we're coming to setters and getters. You will love IntelliJ in a second. Well, that's exaggeration, but I hope you do. Did you see that? I can now access that array directly through its interface. This is like its interface, right? The public private hides or doesn't. Not a private class, Charlotte. Very rarely would you ever need a private class. Private class is actually not an intelligible concept. It doesn't make sense. All your classes are public, right? But, and it's a default thing, but your member variables are not. You might have how would you have a private class? If you had a private class within the scope of another class, you can have that, okay? Private is a real thing because you never do that with your data. You never expose it. The only way that you get access to it, right, is, yeah, you make it private. So I see your question now, Charlotte, because it says public there. So your question is actually really logical. Why would you change that to private? Actually, it's a default prefix. You have to declare anything to do with object with private. There's another category called protected. So there are three, actually there are three. No, variables, but actually I can see that it says public class as well. So the question is, I think, not unreasonable at all. You have three, you have private, public, and protected. Protected I will introduce perhaps in the second or third week after Easter when we talk about inheritance and how that works, okay? That's a tricky concept and there's stuff inside your coursework related to it, but it's quite advanced and it won't, you know, be a make or break with the coursework, trust me. Okay, so it's generally always public. So the data is hidden. How do we access it? Someone, Sol, I think, said getters and setters. Watch what you can do once you declare your private member variables, right? You can right click inside your class and down here, do you see there's something called generate? I don't know if anyone's seen this before. Click generate and it allows you to build, it says getters and setters, right? I'm going to just build them. You should do this as well when you get a chance to, and we're going to do the constructor as well. But watch how it does it. It opens up a window and it says, what getter or setter do you mean? At the moment, I haven't explained what getters and setters are, right? But just stick with it. At the moment, I actually don't want to expose that array. You see, I don't want a getter or setter for it. Let me get rid of that and just add another value, right? Let's just say that I have some important value, right, inside, and it's an integer. Now, this is where you would, this is a much more obvious case of a getter or a setter. You do that, point it to your important value, and it does this. It generates two chunks of getter and setter. So let's just quickly analyze what they do. They're public. That means they're part of the interface of the object. They return an integer, and this is called get import value. Actually, I should have called it important value. So you could just get the cheekiness of it. Important. Here we go. Let me just rewrite that. Okay. Important value, right? Yeah. And this is great because it updates all the connected code. There we go. So it's changed everything. Always say yes when it asks you to engage that, but say no if it tries to improve your code. Because when it does that, it will end up possibly confusing you. But look at this, get important value, it returns that value. Set important value, receives a value and updates that value. Here's the question. I don't know if anyone's thought of the logical question when you look at that example. Is there a really obvious question behind it? A data validation. So Adriana's answered a question no one's asked. And Nikhil has asked a question, is there a reason that important isn't private? Actually, it should have been. There wasn't, that was just me being lazy. I should have said private. Okay, so here's the rule. And I'm gonna pick up Adriano's point. That's hidden. These are part of the interface. But hang on, isn't the obvious point here, if all you're doing with that one is just returning it and that one setting it, what's the difference between adding that chunk of code and making that public? Which is a question I think I try to answer. It is actually tricky at this level of complexity. Adriana's answered that question. You can't read its value, but actually what these end up doing is controlling access to that piece of data, right? A get, you can put validation in here. You can have if statements. You can check other conditions to whether you're going to release that information back. When you set a value, you can have conditions on what the incoming value is and make sure it satisfies certain conditions. And only if they do that bit. So you can put if statements in here. You can do more complex stuff inside here. If you simply didn't have those and you made that public, you run the risk that the world can access that and do what the hell they like, and you've got no control over its interface to that. Remember, although I'm using the word interface I'm using it in the looser and broader sense, right? You can make it increment every time you access it. Exactly. You can do all kinds of really important stuff, right? So that's what getters and setters are. Get is give it to me, set, update it, or set it. Let's go to our client and let's have a look at it actually in the interface. There we go, NB array dot. I can set an important value if I want to, and I can get my important value. That's a very good question. I thought it defaulted to, I want to answer Zach's question because I don't have the answer off the top of my head. I missed that out, remember? I missed that out. Let's get rid of that for a second and let's see if we can just answer your question. So it's got no specifier. What does it actually default to? It defaults to private. It's not visible. Okay, so I think that answers your question, Zach. So if you forget to put private here, the default value will be private, which is a reassuring thing because I'm constantly forgetful. And if in your code, you write your member variables and you forget to put the word private in front. So that's explaining getters and setters, right? But what we really need to do is get on with this thing, this array. This array is really the heart of it. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that and get rid of all of that. Hopefully that's clear. Now, what I want to do is I have an array. When I create an array in the client, I have to specify the size and then I populate it. Actually, I can do it two ways. I can just give it a collection, or I can specify the size and then populate it. We're going to do the second one. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, and this is the only bit that's going to take a little bit of time. Wish I could pause this. Right, there we go. I created an init function, which asks for an integer. How many integers do you want? It returns that. Okay, and so what I'm going to do with my init function, which is in my front end code, come over here. I'm going to say, right, at the moment we're missing a concept. That line there creates the object. That information is what you call initialization data. It's in there that you want to really say straight up what the size of your array is. At the moment, it's not designed with any constructor, any way of specifying that. Now, this is what you do. Come back to here, go left, right click, generate, and you go to constructor. Now, I don't want to construct and pass the whole array in, so I'm not going to select anything, and it's going to create this thing here. Now, notice a couple of things about it. This is a constructor. What is a constructor? How does it look? How can you tell? Look at the name of the class. It's the only method that has identical name to the class, right? Because internally it says anything that has the same name as the class is the constructor, right? So what does the constructor do? The constructor satisfies a bunch of rules. Yes, Tom, absolutely. That's the other observation to make. Notice it only has the word public. And picking up Charlotte's question from earlier, again, it makes no sense to make a constructor private because this is part of the way you create the object. This will specify the rule of what you're going to do. Okay. So it has no return type. It's used in this line of code here. If that bracket in my constructor is empty, which it is, that's fine. But if I pop in here int size and I do this, right, it's going to complain. I take my array, and for those of you who have, a nice thing about tab 9 is it's completing code for me. Look at that line of code inside my constructor. I receive a size and I build the array to that size. Come back to my construct my actual object creation, and it's complaining. And what is it saying? It should be saying, you either remove the parameter from your constructor, right? Or you put a value in there, 3. That means that it's going to pass 3 in, come back over to my back end and build my empty array with size 3. Nice and simple. The problem is with it is that the user has no control if I hard code it. So I wrote this init, which just simply returns that. So let's go back to our application and replace the word size, number 3, actually, with my, actually, I haven't built my utility, have I? Look, I haven't built my console utility. So let's build my utility code. So it's called console utilities. I'm going to just call it CS. I think that's not necessarily the best name. Someone called it CI, which was quite a good name. I'll call it CU in this case, as taking the first letters from each object. I'll create a new console utility. In this case, note here, in my console utility, I have no constructor, right? But I can still build the object, because what it does by default is it assumes you can build an object without any initialization data. This is not storing, this console utility isn't storing anything either. So I can just build it like that. So now I can use it, come into here, say CU, my object, and I grab my init function. So that line of code will execute what's in the bracket first. Think of this like BODMAS, right? It will run that bit of code, which will jump to my client, and it will do that. It'll return that value. GetInt simply does what most of you would expect, right? Then it would come back here, return an integer. Where am I? Sorry, there. It would come back here and it would pass that value into the bracket over to the constructor, come to the constructor, it receives it over here, and then makes my array. Initially, it might sound like a lot, but it's actually really easy. So there we go. I've just got my object built. How do I test that I've got an empty array? At this stage, it's a bit tricky, and I don't want to get too, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to populate it. So let's populate the array, right? I'm going to use, one thing I can do is this. Let's get a for loop, a standard for loop, right? I'm going to set some simple index, set it to 0, because arrays are always starting at 0. And here again, you'll notice that, anyway, I'll be quiet. Now, how many times should it loop? What's the size of the array? Well, this piece of function returned the size and gave it to the object. But at the moment, the object doesn't give that information out. So why not create a simple method in here, return an integer, and say, let's call it size, right? Or get size to be consistent, right? So I want to get the size. Anyone have any idea what I'm going to return from here? What would go in there? How do you get the size of an array? Anyone remember? No? Yeah, okay. If you do the array, not -1, no, that's the index, the top index, Lucas. You simply do IA length to get the size of an array, right? So if that was correctly built, that should give me back a value, right? So let's come back over here. And what I'm going to say is I'm going to say object NB array, give me the size. Oops, I'm using my tabby thing, and let me just type it in, get size. There you are, get size. There we go. Right, and we've got the last one, which is the increment. Okay, so notice straight away, this object is hiding stuff away from me. I've still got this horrible loop, and we can talk about how you would get rid of that. And when I was writing the code for the, the sort of a version of the code which would work for the coursework, I realized you could grab that whole populate object and chuck it into your console application. And I'll show you how to do that in a sec. In fact, let's do that. Watch this technique. Someone in the week asked me this, so I'm going to try to answer this. Right. Let's cut it out from there. Let's go to my console utility. And let's say public, I'm not at the moment return anything.
And the first and last name as well.
You are audible, folks. Populate array. And what I'm going to pass to this is my object. So what type of data is it? It's NB array, and I'm going to call it NB for short, right? Oops.
Then what you do is go Java. Some of them are really hard.
Okay, who's got their mic on? Take your mic off.
Oh shit! Fuck.
Right. Okay. Look what I can do. I can shove all of this. Now this is, I know it's very good. And it's good that I don't know what you were doing, but it sounded very helpful. Look, I can shove all of that over to here. Now here's a really interesting thing. And this is an abstract concept, but this is really fundamental to that. Don't worry, it's not a problem. This is fundamental to object-oriented programming. For this populate array method, I pass it an object and I can do my populate stuff inside here, but I'm not returning the objects. When I come over to here, right, not over to here, over to here, right, and I say my console utility dot, where is it, populate array, I give it the array, which is NB array, but hang on, you say to me, it's not giving the array back. I'm just giving the array to it. So how do I get the array back from it? Now, this is an abstract concept and maybe a little bit theoretical, but it's quite fundamental to the power of objects. When I pass objects, and this includes a string, incidentally, the string data type is quite a complex object, but whenever I pass an object as a parameter, I don't pass the object as a parameter. Does anyone know what I actually pass? Daniel, you get you get points for entertainment. The address. Okay, absolutely. Essentially, I mean, address reference, let's try to, and argument's another word for parameter. Okay, that's just a synonym for the same word. No, you don't pass NB array. What you actually pass is, you've got to think of an object like this, right? You all know what RAM is, RAM, random access memory. When you create your application, whenever you fire anything up on your mobile phones and your computers, it loads it up into RAM, okay? Who passed the course B? Okay, I'm not sure what that means. You load it up into RAM. Whenever you create an object, whenever you run that line of code, it actually on the hardware on your computer loads up, not a pointer, but very close to a pointer. Pointers are hidden behind it. That's a really good point. In C, there were pointers and you're dereferencing. It's very close to that, Tom. That shows me that you know C, and that's a really powerful concept, actually. Yes, so let me just try to clarify. What's the right word for it? Well, I don't mind using location. Danny's good term, location, address, or reference. So what do we mean? Well, okay, so when I run that line that I've highlighted, the new line, it goes to RAM and it occupies, that object occupies a chunk of my RAM, okay? And in RAM, you have two features. I don't know if you've been paying attention to your architecture unit, but basically it has data sitting in that location, and you have a location, an address, literally like an address, right? A place. And what happens when you pass it around in your code, you pass the address of that object. So imagine that you've got a friend who lives in a certain location, right? And you want to interact with that friend, you want to chat to them. You clearly don't lift the whole house up and pass the house to the person who's going to do it. You know where they live, so you know how to get in touch with them, right? The address of the object is what's passed around. What Tom said when he said a pointer, think of it like a pointer. Think of it something that points to the object, which is sitting in the same location. Hard for me to manage having a friend. Yeah, okay. So the idea is that if I pass it into this method here, I'm passing the location of the object, which means that when I'm doing stuff with it over here, inside here, this is just a label, right? When I add stuff to it, it will change the original data, the original array. It doesn't make a copy of it. It doesn't pass the object, and then you have to return the object and then write it back into that same hard, that RAM location. It's got hold of the location. Everything it does will alter the original data. Now that has a massive implication for security, for memory leaks, for tons and tons of things. It's one of the risky elements of proper object-oriented programming, because you're passing addresses for the actual piece of data. Last year, a really excellent student, he's still excellent this year in his second year, pointed out to me that one of the methods we were using, we were passing a whole array into the object. And what he pointed out was, because we're passing the address reference, the client can still access the data directly. And he's absolutely right for it. Anyway, so here I can do what I like with this, whatever this is, and it will alter the original data because I've got access to the original data. I know I've gone on about that a little bit, but it saves you so much trouble later. I don't know who did Visual Basic when they studied previously to come into university. Okay, in an early version of Visual Basic, its default way of passing stuff around was by making a copy of that data and passing the copy. So if you change the copy, it didn't change the original data. When VB went from VB6 to VB.NET, it's essentially the same as C#.NET. I know it might look babyish and other people freak out when they see it, but VB.NET is as powerful as C#.NET because they both sit on the same infrastructure. But VB.NET now passes everything by reference, right? A bit like a pointer, right? But they're very close concepts. So whatever I do here will alter and populate my thing. So in here, I want to populate my array, okay? Let's come back to our application because this is taking longer, but I hope this is useful to you. Okay, so I can populate my array. So you'd need to complete that bit of code inside here. What would you do? What would you do to populate it? Well, you would do this kind of thing. NB, index position, and you'd write into it whatever value you want to write. So you'd do your getInt. You'd call getInt on it because they're all integers. And you would say, please enter number int, right? And that's a pretty useless prompt because, you know, it's kind of vague, right? Why is it not happy with that? Array type expected found. There's obviously something I've just done wrong and I can't quite work it. Oh yeah, because I'm treating it like an array. It isn't an array. How do I write to this array? That NB is not an array, it's my object. Let's go back to my object. Have I got any way of adding to that array? No. Right, so let's create a quick method to actually add to it. So it's not returning anything. I'm going to call it append. You pass it a value. And I'm going to do this very quickly. And you might want to copy and paste this because you will use a mechanism like this. I'm going to make up a private index value. And just watch what I do here. This is one way of doing this. Private int index, right? So when you build this object, actually it should be just index. I should just declare it there. I'll be consistent, index, right? And then in my constructor, I set my index equal to 0. So I'm simulating having an indexing system. If that index value is greater than the length, then I've reached the end. So what I'm going to do is stick an if statement, and it's just going to return. And what's going to go in the if statement? I'm doing this quickly, but just see if you can bear with me. If my index is greater than or equal to the length of the array, then clearly I'm full. It's populated. Return, don't add any more. If it's not the case, then what you do is you get your array inside your object with the made up index value, and whatever not size, let's call this value, you pop that into there, right? Then what you do, you increment, you have to artificially increment your own internal index value. That's private. That is completely and utterly hidden from view, okay? Now that append method, I would tell you without a shadow of a doubt, you are going to use a variation. You can nick that one, or you can make a variation for your coursework, because you'll be doing something similar. What will you be doing in your coursework? You will be having an array of data, but it won't be a primitive data type. It will be a type of data you yourself will have to create, right? I think the grade manager, does the grade manager next week? Might do anyway. And so you will need to have your own append method. So let's get our append method. Let's go back over to console utils and let's do it. Let's use it. I do that dot append, and look, it's saying append, give me the value, right? So I click append. I don't need to do all of that equal sign. I just drop get int inside it. And what get int is, if I just hit a carriage return so you can just see it a bit clearer. So what the append does is, first of all, I call get int. This will give me an integer, hand it back, pass it to append over here, comes to append, passes it in here, checks it hasn't exceeded the length. This I should have spent more time with you. Okay, so this is just me giving you some cheat code. Then internally, I set the value and increment my index, right? There's obviously all kinds of risks, but do you notice that I am now completely and utterly controlling the interface? The interface to this array, where is it? To this array is controlled by the methods I'm creating. I've created my own get size. I've created my own append method. I've got a constructor which creates the object. That's what you do with objects. Objects are fantastic at creating an interface to manage the data inside it. So all I've managed to do so far, and you will say that is really time consuming, but shall we just see if we've got a few minutes to test it? Let's get populate array. Let's go in there into the application and let's see if it works. I'm going to actually put a breakpoint in, run it in debug mode. You don't have to do this yourself, but this will allow me to see what's inside it, okay? So how many integers? Let's say I wanted to store 3. Then it jumps to this really useful window. I'm going to just run that line of code by, see there's a little arrow in the bottom down here called step over. Step over means execute that line, but only that line of code. I click that, and if it breaks, it will break in a second. And oh, you know what? It's expecting user input in the console. Please enter an int, 34. Please enter a second one, 45. Please enter a third, 67, right? Now I've come to the end of that populate. Shall we see whether it's populated it? Let's go to my debugger. I go to my, there is NB array. This is debug, so you can see the inside. Can you see down here? I can see that IA, the internal array, is now populated with 34, 45, 67. And it's got, and the index value is set at 3. This is visible because we are running in a development environment. So it doesn't matter if you made variables, but it can matter. But in this setting, you get access to stuff you wouldn't when you normally execute. So, you know, you can't just take a normal application, throw it into an environment, and it will show you all this hidden machinery inside it. But here, if you look down here, it worked. So let's let's actually demonstrate it. We've got a few more minutes. Are you still all here, or have you all just passed out from, you're still with me? So shall we just, almost, okay. So let's display it. Now I very cheekily created this rather useful method here, but actually this receives an array. So that's not so good. What I'm gonna do is I need a way of displaying the content of it. So I'm gonna do one voluntary coma. Perfect. I'm gonna try one last thing, if you can bear it for a second, right? I want to see what's inside my array. If I right click my array and go to generate, there is a really nice generic function called toString. It will be, no, it will be, Ryan, it'll be on the web under all the live lectures. This one I might pop onto it, okay, but I'll keep it on just there. So if I click toString, you select the data you want to include. So I don't want to select the int. I only want the array. So I say okay to that. And it generates this, look at this. It generates a toString method, which means it's going to return that. Now, this is a cheat. I don't want you using this, and I apologize for using it in this example. This is a cheat of displaying everything. It doesn't display it accurately. You should really have some kind of loop because I'm being lazy and we've only got 5 minutes. Okay, less than 5 minutes. All right, I will do it. I would do it not properly, but I create an empty string, right, in my toString method. I'm going to iterate through my array, and I'm going to do something it's not happy with. I'm going to basically lift out each item inside my array, right? So how do I do that? What's nice about it is I can do this. And I can, what's the name of the array inside here? Is it IA? It is IA. There we go. See that loop I mentioned before? This loop is an iterative loop. It takes that object, because arrays are also objects, right? And lets you select every item one at a time. So I can go item, and let's put a carriage return. Say, let's put a \n, which means a carriage, right? So that will build it, and then let's just return it, return S, right? That's it. It's not the best way to do it, and I've missed out that. Okay, so that's quite crude way of doing it, and I've got an error because I put colon, a semicolon, right? That is a half decent way of doing it. It is, yes, for item in list name in Python. In fact, item in list, you know, probably inspired the Java developers to kind of work on this type of concept, right? So it's a nice concept. Again, you will write your own toString method for your coursework. So everything I'm showing you in variation and extension, you'll be using. Okay, that's the advantage. Let's use it. Let's come back to the application over here and let's display it. So we'd say NB array dot, where is it, toString. I need to pop it into my console, right, tool, my console tool, which will output a string, right? So let's just bury it inside there, right? Do that, hit there, hit the end of the bracket, hit carriage return. Thanks for whoever found rainbow brackets, because can you see the rainbow colors there? This is a parameter being passed into that out method inside console utils. See, it's that parameter. It may not look like it, but it is. So in theory, I don't need to run this in debug. I should just be able to run it. And if I've done this right, how many integers do you want? Let's say 3. Please enter 3, 5, 7. There they are, 3, 5, 7. It saves my eyes as well. I bet you my eyes are worse than yours, Tom. Okay, so that is probably a good place to stop. Notice 2 things before I finish, right? This toString method, you will write your own version of it. So everything I'm showing you today, everything, no, I won't do that. Everything I'm showing you today, you are basically on your step to building your coursework. Remember, this is managing an integer array. In the coursework, you will be managing your own custom data type array. And on the other side of Easter, with some hints, it's a rainbow brackets is a plugin, Jin. So you can literally go to preferences, a plugin, and get it. It helps so much. Look at that. You can see the beginning and end of stuff, right? With all this white space. This version, if you literally copied and pasted that and used that inside your coursework, students did it last year. Yeah, that's a good point. This, you don't worry about. It's because they have their own built-in toString, and that's built into the object hierarchy. Using override tells the system, don't worry, this person is just not using ours, they've kind of adapted it and they're using their own. Okay, so everything I've shown you today is in variation, 1 step away, 2 steps away from actually what you're building. So if I were to summarize your coursework, you are going to basically build a nice interface, which is going to have some kind of infinite loop. This is how it's looking at the moment, right? And in that infinite loop, you'll list all the objects inside your array, and you'll give the option to select one and to reorder it. So there's going to be issues of sorting as well. So if you want a simple exercise, right, I'll finish what I'm saying, and then you'll select them, change the value, and then work with it. It's a little, it'll have more in it than that, but the gist and its connection to this is where they two things connect, right? Now, if you want to really help yourself, I would recommend you build everything I've built, right? I think there's a variation on it in all the lecture notes for next week anyway. And then I would build a sort. Now, I don't want you to make up a mechanism. I want you to try to sort. In fact, here's a head start. Next week's group breakout exercise will be for you to build an integer array sort, okay? And that doesn't mean that you go and get a component in the library and use it. I want your thinking process and for you to think about how you actually go about sorting an integer array. You have bubble sorts, you have, well, you have all kinds of them. Now, the real question of why I'm getting you to do it is because when you leave university, you probably use a bubble sort built in from a library or a quick sort or so on. Anyone can do that. You don't need to come to university to do it, right? There's no value in you actually being here and studying it if all you're going to do is software development and use libraries, right? There are at least 10% in this year group who could do that already, right? And I was talking to several of you this week and trying to stop you from doing what you're doing. What I'm trying to teach you is the thinking process. Think how a sort would work. In your groups next week, think how a sort would work. Now, sorts, if you write a sort, here's the challenge, and I'll write it into the group exercise. Hopefully I remember this, to use recursion. Has anyone heard of recursion? Recursion, great, that's good news. Recursion is a really powerful technique, but it can be really obscure when you stumble into it. Yeah, oh no, not recursion. Oh no, not recursion. And off it goes and spins it. It's when a function you use within the function calls the function, right? Yeah, that's a great quote for recursion. So I'm going to give you, when I give you this group exercise, that sort you'll need in your coursework. You'll need to have your own mechanism of a sort. How you build it is up to you. You could use an inner and outer loop. You could use recursion. You could use it in different combinations. What I want you to do is not just build it. I want you to think about it, because your learning takes place when you put some thought into it and pull it together. Because, you know, let's face it, you could literally, you could literally grab tons of code off the internet and dump it in there. And there is no benefit of being here. Honestly, you'll go to your first job and you'll probably get your first sacking. Your first being sacked will be your first job, unless you're already really talented, in which case that doesn't really hold for you. It's just awkward to have those people who are good at stuff already. But here's my point to you. University's got to teach you those skills so it builds your confidence up. And you know what a sort is because you've built your own. So you can use any sort, because if someone says, well, you know, yeah, that's a good one, Nick, good. So please understand from what I'm trying to say, it isn't just a question of you building the coursework and getting through. You're allowed to use any sorting algorithm, but you cannot use inbuilt libraries. You have to write the mechanisms yourself, because that process is where your thinking builds up, right? That's where the advantage is to you. If any learning is going to take place for you lot, it's going to be there, right? Bogo sort, right? You play with them, Robert. Play with it. Divide and conquer. There's a fantastic using divide and conquer when you're doing a search, right? If you sort a number sequence, look at this, just to pick up your point, Robert. I had to write a bit of code for a second year task. We sorted it, and then if you divide it down the middle and you check if the number is in that group, it speeds up, it creates all kinds of accelerations through it. If you want a good book and you want to be good at proper programming, then get your hands on grokking algorithms, okay? My perennial, not just to you, Aaron, I meant to send that to everyone, hang on. Okay, so we're near the end. So my point is, right, the coursework, when you get to it, will not shock you. The aim of what I'm doing in the teaching process is try to encourage a learning process, right? Geeks for Geeks is very good, you're right, absolutely. So my aim is not really to say it's impossible for you to do, right? I'm not the type of person who teaches, who makes a problem so obscure, you could fail it because you just misread it. That's not my aim. My aim is to make it clear what I'm asking you to do and for you to stretch your thinking processes to learn stuff, right? Okay. And so please think about it like this. No idea what's going on. I think it's probably time to finish, folks. We've hit the 5 o'clock. It's the end of the day, and you all need to relax and have a good rest of the evening. I'm going to stop the share and the recording. Let's just stop the recording.